Hello and welcome to E233. I'm your instructor, Gregory Myers. This video, we're going to take another look at our student course registration system demo, and specifically we're going to take a look at our compare student function. This video assumes that you have watched the earlier videos that set up the student course registration system, as well as the StaticArray.h. And it assumes that you also have copies of the other .h files as well as the students.csv and have completed certain functions in your core demo. So let's go ahead and get started by taking a look at our StaticArray.c, and you'll note that our function accepts two input arguments of student type. The idea here is that we want to do a field-by-field comparison of the first student to the second student, and if there are no differences between the students, then we will assume that they are the same student. Now, the data structure that you're using does determine how this compare student function works, but in this particular case, we want all of the fields to match in order for it to be a matching student. So to begin with, I would encourage you to go ahead and pull up your scrs.h so that you can recall the fields for your student type. Also note that we'll be doing something very similar for our course and for our registration. And what you also want to do is remember how our string compare function worked, in that if it saw a match between two strings, it returned a 0, which indicated there were 0 differences between the two students. We are once again going to follow this pattern in this function. And so essentially what we're going to do is we're going to compare each one of the fields, and if each one of the fields match, then we return results equal to 0, and if they don't, we return some other value. So let's get started. This is going to be a rather large if statement that's going to span multiple lines. I'll start with the simplest field, which will be the student status, and we simply compare then that the first student's status matches the second student's status, and this is why I said that we're going to have a rather large if statement, because we want to not only compare this, but we also want to compare then each of the subsequent fields, the student ID, the student first name, middle initial, and last name. And here is where our earlier string compare function will be very useful, in that what we'll do now is we'll leverage our own string compare to compare the first student's student ID with the second student's student ID, and we will assume that we don't care about case in this particular scenario, so we'll specify then case insensitive. And in the string compare function, we're looking for a value of 0, in other words, no differences between the two. And we do the same thing now for our first student first name and our second student first name. And once again, we're going to assume that we're okay with it being case insensitive. And if that is equal to 0, and you probably have established the pattern already, so probably a little bit of careful copying and pasting will help here. We'll do this not only for the first name, but also the middle initial and our last name. So let's go ahead and change our fields our last name, and if all 5 of our fields match, then we have a match between the 2 students, in which case we just simply want to say results equal to 0, which means there is no difference. Under the else, in other words, if one of those 5 conditions is false, then the whole if statement will be false. Then we'll simply say results equal to 1. And notice here we have no way of tracking what is different. And so one of the things we could consider is having a compare that did one of 2 things, or possibly both, is pick the field to compare, and then have some way of ordering the results. So in other words, for example, much like we did with our string compare, where we would have -1, 0, and 1, which -1 implied that the first student would come before the second student, 0 would imply that they are the same student, and 1 would imply that the first student came after the second student. Well, once again, you would have to have some way of tracking which field to compare. So this is a great starting point for a sorting function. For this particular example, we simply want to return 0 for the number of differences between the students, or 1 if there are in fact some differences between the students. So once again, let's go ahead and build it. And hopefully you found this video useful. As always, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, don't hesitate to email me. And thank you for watching.